There is a document that would completely change what you believe about Jesus, a document that has been kept secret for more than 2,000 years. A letter written by Pontius Pilate, the man who condemned Jesus to death, addressed directly to Emperor Tiberius of Rome, and in that letter, Pilate describes something that nobody expected. He describes the physical appearance of Jesus with such specific details, so impressive, that when you find out, you will understand why he was so afraid of him, why he trembled in his presence, why, even though having the power to kill him, he hesitated. Because Pilate saw something in Jesus that was not human, something that terrified him, something that made him question if he was really seeing a man or if he was in the presence of a god. And when you discover what Pilate wrote, when you read the exact description of Jesus' appearance, everything starts to make sense. The miracles, the crucifixion, the celestial phenomena, the resurrection, everything, because Pilate was not writing to deceive the emperor. He was writing as a man who had witnessed something so extraordinary that he needed to leave a record of the truth. Because here's what's most disturbing. The description that Pilate makes of Jesus does not correspond to any image you've seen in a church. It does not correspond to any traditional painting, no sculpture, no movie. It is completely different. And when you discover what Jesus really looked like, when you see through Pilate's eyes, you understand why those who saw him were never the same again, why his disciples were willing to die for him, why even his enemies couldn't stop talking about him. Pilate saw Jesus personally, talked to him, observed his presence, felt his power, and when he writes this letter, he is not speaking as a politician trying to please the emperor. He is speaking as a man who saw something that defied his entire understanding of reality, a man who was confessing, through this letter, that he had released someone extraordinary, someone who was not a common criminal, someone who was much, much more than that. Let us discover together what Pilate really saw. Pilate was not an ordinary man. He was the Roman governor of Judea, a man of power, a man who had authority over life and death, a man who had conquered cities and subjugated populations. But when he arrives in Judea, something different happens. He feels that he has no control, that something is wrong, that there are forces at play that he cannot understand. And it's this disturbing sensation that leads him to write the letter, because Pilate needed to record, needed to leave a document, needed to tell the emperor about that strange man called Jesus, who was changing everything. Pilate begins the letter saying that the events in his province were so extraordinary that he felt a compulsion to tell everything in detail. And already in this opening you notice something. A Roman governor, a man of war, is admitting he was frightened. He is admitting that something terrorized him so much that he needed to write to the emperor. Because Pilate knew that if he didn't leave a record, nobody would believe what he was about to describe. Nobody would believe that a simple man from Nazareth had caused so much impact, that a carpenter had made him, Pontius Pilate, tremble with fear. Pilate describes that he first saw Jesus in a crowd, leaning against a tree, teaching, and he ordered his secretary, a trusted man named Manlius, to infiltrate the crowd to listen to what Jesus was saying. And when Manlius returned, he said that he had never seen in all Greek and Roman philosophy anything that compared to the wisdom of Jesus' words. Pilate was fascinated, but it was not just fascination. It was something more profound. It was as if he had recognized something in that man that defied logic, that defied his experience, that defied reality. And here's the most important. Pilate could have simply arrested Jesus, could have ordered him exiled. He had the power to do that. He had the authority. But he didn't. Because when Pilate finally meets face to face with Jesus, when he feels his presence, he cannot do anything. He simply cannot. Because there's something in Jesus' presence that paralyzes, that intimidates. That makes you question if you're really in the presence of a common human or if you're standing before something celestial, something that you cannot explain with words. And that's why Pilate writes the letter, to try to explain, to try to leave it on record, to try to make the emperor understand that he was not being weak or incompetent, that there were profound reasons why he had allowed Jesus to act freely, that there were reasons that transcended politics and rational logic, because Pilate recognized, even if he couldn't openly admit it, that he had in his hands someone who was not a political threat. He was a spiritual threat, a threat to the very concept of reality that Rome had built. Pilate had ordered Jesus to be called to the praetorium. He wanted to talk to this man who was causing such a stir in Jerusalem. When Jesus finally arrived, something extraordinary happened. Pilate was standing on the balcony when he saw Jesus approaching, and he describes in the letter that his feet literally froze, as if they were glued to marble. His entire body trembled. Pilate, a man of war, a man who had seen everything, felt like someone with deep guilt, like he was in the presence of something sacred, something that defied his understanding. Pilate tries to maintain composure, talks about the 3 years he had given freedom to Jesus, talks about the wise words he had heard, compares Jesus with Socrates and Plato, says that Jesus was above all philosophers. But as he speaks, Pilate feels the weight of Jesus' presence upon him, feels that he's losing control, that he cannot position himself as an authority, that there is something in that man that paralyzes him, that intimidates him, that makes him question if he is really a common human being or something much more. And then Pilate offers protection to Jesus, says that the praetorium will be a sacred refuge, that his enemies won't be able to touch him there, that he, as Roman governor, will guarantee his safety. But Jesus responds with serenity, says that when the time comes, there is no refuge, neither on earth nor beneath it, that the true refuge is in the heavens, and that what was written by the prophets will be fulfilled. Pilate feels the weight of these words, feels that he is hearing someone who knows exactly what's going to happen, that he has already accepted his fate. Pilate insists, tries to use his authority, transforms his request into an order, says that the safety of the province is his responsibility, that Jesus needs to be more cautious, that he needs to moderate his speeches. But Jesus just smiles with serenity and responds that he did not come to bring disturbance but peace, love, and charity, that he was born on the same day that Augustus brought tranquility to the Roman Empire, and that persecutions will come not because of him but because of others, because he must follow the will of his Father. And then Jesus withdraws. Pilate describes it as like a light disappearing on the horizon, and that relieved him deeply, because his presence was very heavy, very charged. Like being in the presence of something that transcended human reality. And here's the most important point that Pilate puts in the letter. He confesses that he was afraid, that a Roman governor was afraid of a simple man, and this fear held him, because when you're afraid of someone that way, you can't simply send him to his death. You hesitate, you question. And here comes the part that everyone wants to know. The physical description of Jesus, according to Pilate. Because in the letter, Pilate describes Jesus with impressive detail, says that Jesus was of average height, neither very tall nor very short, but there was something in his presence that made him seem bigger, that made him seem imposing. Pilate describes that the complexion of Jesus was that of someone who spent time outdoors, but still maintained a healthy appearance, a well-cared-for appearance. It was not the appearance of someone living in misery. It was not the appearance of a beggar or vagrant. It was of someone who, even living a simple life, maintained his dignity and his appearance. But the most shocking detail in Pilate's description is Jesus' hair. Pilate describes that Jesus had long, soft hair that fell harmoniously over his shoulders. And here's the detail that is surprising. The hair was slightly wavy and described as light brown, almost blonde. Pilate says that this completely differentiated him from the people of the region, because at that time, in Judea, most people had darker hair, more black, more curly, but Jesus had hair that stood out, hair that drew attention, hair that made him seem different, unique. And then Pilate talks about the eyes, and he says that Jesus' eyes were perhaps his most notable characteristic. Pilate describes them as deep and penetrating, eyes that seem to see everything, that seemed to understand the hearts of people. Some said that the eyes varied between light brown and blue depending on who was observing, depending on the perspective. But regardless of the color, there was something in those eyes that conveyed wisdom, that conveyed kindness, but it also conveyed a firmness, a profound understanding of life and the human heart. Pilate had never seen eyes like that. Jesus' skin is described by Pilate as fair, with a smooth texture, like the skin of someone who spent time outdoors but still maintained a healthy and well-cared-for appearance. And then Pilate describes Jesus' beard, a full and well-cared-for beard, that added maturity and respect to his appearance. Pilate highlights that it was not a neglected beard. It was not the beard of someone negligent. It was a beard that showed that Jesus cared about his appearance, that he maintained his dignity even in the face of circumstances. And here's the most important that Pilate puts in the letter. He says that Jesus' face was beautiful and symmetrical, with features that inspired trust and respect. But it was not just physical beauty. It was something more profound. It was as if Jesus' face reflected something internal, something that transcended physical appearance. Pilate describes that without needing to speak a word, Jesus conveyed peace, conveyed welcome, conveyed authority without being intimidating, and that was the most impressive, because it was as if Jesus could communicate everything just with his presence, just with his face. Pilate describes in the letter that Jesus was not an ordinary man, that there was something in him that defied understanding, because friends and enemies of Jesus alike all recognized that he had control over the elements. Like a potter molding clay, Jesus turned water into wine, healed diseases, raised the dead, calmed storms. He even made fish appear with coins in their mouths. Pilate highlights that these deeds were witnessed by thousands of people, both by his followers and by his enemies. So these were not rumors, they were not legends. They were events that really happened, that were verified. And it is precisely because of these deeds that Jesus aroused such hostility, because nobody could explain them rationally. Nobody could understand how a man could do these things. The Jewish religious leaders were furious, because Jesus demonstrated a power that they did not have, a power that was not political, that was not military. That was something completely different, something spiritual. And Pilate perceives in the letter that the real reason they wanted to kill Jesus was not because he had committed political crimes. It was because he had demonstrated a power that defied the entire religious structure that had been built. Pilate narrates that Jesus was not accused of breaking common laws. He was not accused of directly harming anyone. There were no political victims that could be pointed out. But still, the crowd screamed for his death. And that confused Pilate, because he understood Roman law, he understood justice, and by the law, Jesus had not done anything that deserved death. But there was something in the air, an energy, a collective will to destroy, as if invisible forces were at play, as if there was something much greater happening than simply the condemnation of a man. And then came the day of crucifixion, and extraordinary events began to happen. Pilate describes that when Jesus was crucified, the day began to darken. Like a winter afternoon, it became as dark as night. Black clouds covered the temple and spread across the city. And there was a violent earthquake, an earthquake that affected even Egypt. That filled everyone with terror. And Pilate hears that a Jewish patriarch exclaimed, "Either the Creator is suffering or the universe is collapsing," because those celestial phenomena were not coincidence. They were something supernatural, something that defied the laws of nature. And here's the most disturbing point. Pilate reports that a wise Jew from Antioch, a close friend of Jesus, was found dead after the earthquake. And nobody was sure if it was from the shock of the earthquake or from the pain of seeing Jesus die. And Pilate puts this in the letter because he wants the emperor to understand. When Jesus died, something happened that changed reality itself, that affected not just people, but nature itself. And Pilate recognized that he had witnessed something that completely transcended his understanding as a Roman governor, that he had seen power, real power, divine power. After the crucifixion, Pilate granted permission to a man named Joseph of Arimathea to bury Jesus' body. Joseph used his own tomb, and Pilate ordered that Jewish soldiers be placed around the tomb to ensure that nothing happened to the body, because the religious leaders were afraid. They were afraid that the disciples would steal the body and say that Jesus had risen. So Pilate placed guards, placed protection, everything was controlled, or at least that's what Pilate believed. But what happened in the following days would change everything. A day after the burial, the tomb was found empty, completely empty, and the disciples began to say that Jesus had risen, that he had come back, and Pilate wants to investigate, wants to know what really happened. So he calls the lieutenant who was guarding the tomb, a Roman soldier named Ben Isham, and Ben Isham tells a story that leaves Pilate completely stunned. He says that around the fourth watch, a warm and enchanting light appeared over the tomb. At first he thought they were women coming to embalm the body, as was customary. But then something extraordinary happened. The light increased, and Ben Isham saw what appeared to be a multitude of the dead, of people in their funeral shrouds, but they all seemed young, all full of joy. And celestial music, the most beautiful he had ever heard in his life, filled the air, as if all of heaven was praising God. Ben Isham describes that it was as if the very universe was vibrating with this music, that all of creation was participating in that event. And then the earth began to tremble violently, and Ben Isham felt weak, like the ground was moving beneath his feet. And then Ben Isham fainted. He fell to the ground unconscious. When he woke up, it was already morning, and he didn't know what had happened after. Pilate questions if it could have been the sunrise, if it could have been an illusion, if it could have been lack of sleep. But Ben Isham denies it, says he hadn't slept all night because sleeping on duty was punishable by death, says it wasn't sunrise because it was still very dark, and the light he saw was different. It was something celestial, something that wasn't natural. And when he returned to the tomb with reinforcements, Jesus' body was no longer there. And here's the most important point that Pilate puts in the letter. He investigates the entire occurrence thoroughly, talks to Ben Isham, talks to the soldiers. And when he puts it all together, when he analyzes all the testimonies, Pilate reaches a disturbing conclusion, that there was no theft of the body, that the disciples didn't come to take Jesus, that something really supernatural had happened. And Pilate, a rational man, a man of war, a man who didn't believe in magic, was forced to recognize Jesus had risen, had defeated death, had fulfilled the promise he made. And Pilate admits in the letter that he cannot deny what happened, that the resurrection is real. You made it this far. You discovered what Pilate really wrote about Jesus. You saw through the eyes of a man who was there, a Roman governor who witnessed everything personally, a man who had the power to kill Jesus but hesitated, who had authority to arrest him but released him, because Pilate recognized that there was in Jesus something that transcended his understanding, something that terrified him, something divine. And now you know the truth that was guarded for more than 2,000 years. The truth about Jesus' physical appearance, about his supernatural power, about his resurrection. Thank you for being here. Thank you for questioning. Thank you for seeking the truth. Because what Pilate describes in the letter is not fiction. It is not the invention of someone who wanted to create a dramatic story. It is the testimony of a man who saw, who talked, who felt Jesus' presence, and who couldn't deny what he had witnessed, even being a rational man, even being a Roman governor accustomed to power and authority. Jesus was different. Jesus had something that no other person had, a presence that paralyzes, a power that defied the laws of nature, an ability to overcome even death. And Pilate, faced with all of this, had no choice but to confess the truth. So leave a like on this video, because when you leave a like, you're saying that this truth matters, that the real history of Jesus deserves to be known, that Pilate's letter deserves to be divulged, and that you want more content that reveals the truth behind the narratives we were taught. A like helps the algorithm show this video to more people, to people who are also seeking answers, to people who are also questioning what was taught, to people who are ready for the truth. And subscribe to the channel now, because there is much more to explore. There are historical documents that need to be revealed. There are ancient testimonies that need to be heard. There are truths that were buried and that are waiting to resurface. And you don't want to miss any of these discoveries. When you subscribe, you get notified of each new video. You stay connected to this journey of unearthing the truth. You become part of this knowledge revolution that is happening now. And leave a comment below. Tell me what your discovery was today. Tell me what you found most shocking about the description of Jesus. Tell me if Pilate's letter changed your perspective on who Jesus really was. Tell me if you want to know more about other historical testimonies about Jesus. Because your comments help me know what you want to learn. And your comments help other people discover this video. Because YouTube shows comments to other people. So when you comment, you're helping to spread this truth. Thank you for being here.